Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes of concentrated ancient warfare, which will completely distract you from anything else that's going on in the world today whilst you think about what was happening some 2,000 or more years ago. Of course, what I do here is I attempt to answer the questions of viewers and listeners and readers of the magazine, the podcast, backers on Patreon, senders of postcards, emails, people who stop me in the street. This one's a comment from a video. I can't remember which actual episode it comes from, but it begins, "This episode made me think of a question." Thank you. And it comes from Lexington 476. Thank you, Lexington 476. You, of course, can back us on Patreon if you want. You can become a Legionary, Optio, or Centurion class backer, $1, $5, and $10. You can, of course, listen to the big podcast, which comes out once a month. And there's also an ancient history podcast you can listen to as well. Now, Lexington's question. This episode made me think of a question. In the Western Empire, what was the last recorded legion to take the field as a formed/cohesive unit? And the same question for the Eastern Empire. All right. So let's deal with, are they the same legion? There's all sorts of interesting things about the legions, and I think I spoke quite some time ago, several years ago now probably, about the legions. They all seem to disappear, and we get records of them in the late 4th, early 5th century. And mostly by the fall of the Roman Empire, we don't get mention of them again. And the interesting thing there, of course, is, and I say this because I'm just about to write up an article about the 10th Legion at the Siege of Amida in 359. Now, in that case, the legion we know is 10 Fretensis, and at the Siege of Amida, Ammianus Marcellinus, who's an eyewitness and in the city at the time, doesn't talk about 10 Fretensis. He talks about 10 Fortenses, which, the brave. Is that the same legion? Or is it a different legion? If it's a different legion, we don't know anything more about it. And there's only two 10th legions, the Fretensis and Gemina. And Gemina's in Austria at the time, so it doesn't make any sense. But I think it is the same legion. More of that. Or you can read the magazine. Issue 17.5 will be the one where I talk about that. Anyway, so those legions in the West, we get them mentioned in the Notitia, so there's quite a few of them mentioned in the Notitia. And for the West, we think that the sort of the final date is between 390 and 420. So a lot of the legions are mentioned there for the last time. Of course, by that time, the legion's strength may have dropped down to 1,000 men, maybe, and you get multiple mentions of vexellations or segments of a legion in multiple places around the empire. You get the division of a unit into a seniores and a juniores, a junior and a senior part of the unit. We're not sure whether they're both 1,000 or less men. It's a very, very tricky one. Anyway, one of the fascinating aspects of the late Roman army. So I think in terms of the West, which one is a group rather than a single legion, and we don't really know a lot. They're mentioned in the Notitia, for instance. Is the Notitia a moment in time, and therefore a lot of those legions are not there elsewhere, or next week or a year later they've all moved? So, for instance, there's lots and lots of 38, I think, military units mentioned in Britain when the Notitia is written, and it's dated to 420. But 420 is after we think Rome has abandoned Britain. So hang on, how are there 38 units in the Roman army in approximately 420 AD? Is that prior to that, or were those units still around, or were they remnants of those units that don't actually represent real units that are actually combat effective? It's a paper. It's like a guy with a banner. I am the Second Legion. No, we're not sure. Anyway, that's not what I want to talk about, because in the other instance, of course, we do have one legion which has a much longer history, and that's 5 Macedonica or Macedonica, which is a Roman legion founded in about 43 BC under Octavian. and generally spends a lot of its time in Macedonia, Moesia, and Dacia, and then moves to Egypt, and it's the one that we have the longest military history for, and so into the 7th century, which again is a fascinating aspect of a legion to last that long, because of course by that time, Roman legions don't exist. Well, they do, but they don't. Oh gosh, we get the idea that a Roman legion is mentioned by name. And again, a lot of these units in the Notitia are problematic. But is it the legion we know and love from classical high empire Roman history? Probably not. So what we find in inscriptions in two cities in Egypt are references to this unit in 635 and 637 in Egypt. Now, it's an interesting one because by this time, what we call the Byzantine Empire, but of course, that's a modern phrase. It's the Roman Empire, but it's the Eastern Roman Empire. But it's under threat. Someone claiming to be from a Roman legion in late Roman Byzantine Egypt, is that wishful thinking? Or is it, again, a guy with a banner claiming to be from this legion when it's him and 8 friends, no one more? We don't know. And I think, again, it's an interesting one where if you've got an inscription, presumably, it's important enough for a tradition to name you, and to be named in that tradition. But it's tricky to know whether it's combat effective. We don't really have enough evidence of said things occurring militarily to know whether it actually was a combat effective force. And so, in that sense, that legion, the 5th, is the one with the longest military history, 680 years of military history. It's again a fascinating look at, firstly, the idea of the continuity that some legions have. Some legions go to a single province and stay in that province for their entire military history. Others get moved about and then brought back to said province, the Second Augustan Legion, for instance, in Britain. Others spend a very long time in one particular place and then get moved. And so, for instance, I think we were talking in the previous one about the 10th Fretensis Legion, that spends a lot of time in Judea and Jerusalem and then gets moved to the Gulf of Aqaba. And so what you've got with the 5th Legion is it's founded, and when it's founded, it's basically spent most of its time in Moesia, the province in Moesia. It starts in Macedonia, moves to Moesia, then it moves to Dacia, and then after that, with, interestingly, little side campaigns. So, for instance, when you get the first Jewish war under Nero, it gets sent to the east for that war, but it's still based, technically, still a Moesian legion, and it's fighting in that war. It declares for Vespasian, and parts of it, a big vexillation of 5, 10, and 15 Apollinaris, get sent back to Italy under Mucianus and Domitian, and they secure the throne for Vespasian. Presumably, after that point, those men went back to the east, or did they go back to their home base? We're not sure. And then you get 5 Macedonica is sent en masse back from Judea to Moesia. It then takes part in Domitian's Dacian Wars in the 80s AD. Interestingly, of course, the future Emperor Hadrian serves as the tribune of that legion. And so when the province of Dacia is created in 101, Trajan moves it there. And so it's based in Troismus. And so from that point, of course, it stays in Dacia, and then it moves into the various permutations of the Dacian provinces. Obviously, Dacia begins as 1, becomes 2, becomes 3, goes back to being 1, all sorts of different things in Dacia, and then gets abandoned. It's the first Roman province abandoned. So from that point, of course, 5 is in Dacia until it gets moved again. And when it's moved again, it's moved. Well, come on, brain, where have you gone to? No, it's moved back to Dacia, moved against the Quadi, and then it is finally moved to Egypt, where it becomes part of the Egyptian garrison in the late 3rd century onwards, and that's where it stays for the next more than 300 years. Okay, so it's a fascinating history. Other than mentioning campaigns it's involved in, though, we don't tend to get a lot of evidence. There's quite a few inscriptions from members of the Fifth Macedonian Legion, and it's involved in a lot of campaigns from the Dacian Wars onwards. You get vexallations of it in various places. Even in the Notitia, there's 2 sections of it, one in Egypt, but there's still one in Dacia. So it's a very tricky thing to sort out. But that is the legion with the longest and last mention in military history. So in the 7th century in Egypt. I hope that answers your question, and I hope I made some sense. And join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.